Went on a date recently that stayed on my mind a lot longer than I expected. Not because it was amazing and not because there were any, huge red flags and not because anything dramatic even happened. Actually, that's probably why it affected me so much. Because driving home afterwards, I realized something about myself that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. And, after I briefly mentioned some of it in another video, a lot of the comments kept focusing on the date itself and this idea of peace that I brought up in it. So I started thinking more deeply about why that experience stayed with me. It's hard to ignore, and I had to think about it because I read every comment. Honestly, I think it revealed how differently I look at connection now compared to earlier in my life. Because the truth is, you know, I I didn't leave that date thinking, wow, that was incredible. Actually, it was a lot more complicated than that. There weren't really any obvious red flags. She wasn't toxic. It wasn't hostile. And I honestly don't think there was, bad intent behind any of it. But something about it just didn't feel natural to me. And I couldn't stop thinking about why afterwards. Because sitting there, I realized we weren't approaching the date the same way. No, I came into it thinking, let's have a conversation, let's laugh a little, let's enjoy the moment and slowly learn who each other are over time. But pretty early into the date, the conversation started moving into things that honestly felt way too serious for a first date. Finances, past relationships, questions about marriage, um, and even questions about whether I'd ever remarry again and how soon I'd be open to it. And internally, I was thinking, wow, we barely even know each other yet. And the thing is, none of those are bad conversations to have, but talking about past relationships, talking about marriage, and talking about finances, those are all things that naturally get answered over time if two people genuinely build a connection. And that's not the issue. The issue was the timing. Because to me, a first date is really supposed to be about seeing if you even enjoy being around each other first. Can we laugh together? Can conversation flow naturally? Do we feel comfortable around each other? And do we even enjoy each other's presence? That foundation matters. So when you skip past that part and immediately move into emotional, heavy conversations about the future, it can start feeling less like connection and more like pressure before you even get started. It can, and again, I want to be fair about this. I don't think she was trying to manipulate me. And I don't think that she was a bad person. I think she was trying to figure out whether we were compatible long term. And honestly, I understand, why people do that now, especially later in life. But at this age, most people have already been hurt. They've already invested years into the wrong relationships. They've already dealt with divorce, with betrayal, disappointment, and even loneliness. So there's this pressure to figure everything out quickly, but it's almost like people are trying to protect themselves from wasting more time. And I get that. But sitting there that night, I realized, something very important about myself. I'm not trying to rush anything anymore. And maybe part of that comes from life experiences. Maybe part of it comes from surviving narcissistic abuse and learning what emotional pressure feels like over long periods of time. But I think a lot of it simply comes, from getting older and realizing that healthy connection has a natural pace to it. It develops gradually. There's room to breathe in it, room for curiosity, room for silence, just room for two people to naturally learn each other over time. And honestly, years ago, I probably would have interpreted that entire conversation very differently. I probably would have thought, wow, she's serious. She knows what she wants. This must mean the connection is strong. But now I see things differently because emotional intensity and emotional safety are not the same thing. And that realization, changed the way I experienced that whole date. For the first time, I noticed myself valuing emotional steadiness more than emotional urgency. I realized that I no longer want connection to feel emotionally heavy right from the very beginning. I don't want conversations that feel like interviews for a future role in someone's life before two people have even figured out whether they genuinely enjoy each other's company. And honestly, I think modern dating has started losing all of that. The ability to simply let connection unfold naturally. Now everything feels accelerated. People want certainty immediately, you know, compatibility immediately, commitment immediately, answers immediately. That's all instant gratification. You can't, there's no future in that. But I understand why. I also think sometimes that pressure destroys the very thing that people are looking for. Because real connection usually grows in smaller moments. You know, relaxed conversations, the random laughter, the comfortable silence, the feeling that you can simply exist around someone without constantly trying to move the relationship forward every 5 minutes. And honestly, I think that's ultimately what affected me the most afterwards. Not that the date was terrible, and, again, not that she was a bad person, but the experience made me realize that I no longer want connection to feel, forced, rushed, or emotionally overloaded right from the very beginning. Because the truth is, the inner peace that I've fought to rebuild in my life is not something I'm willing to give up again. I've made that mistake before, and I paid a very heavy price for it. A price that eventually led me to sitting on that date in the first place. You know, Maybe that's part of getting older too. You start realizing that nobody else can give you peace, and nobody else can give you happiness, and nobody else, can give you self-respect. All of those things, you know, each of us has to build within ourselves first. But someone else can absolutely fit into that piece. They can add to it, protect it, and even contribute to it. Or they can slowly disturb it. And I think after enough life experience that you become much more aware of the difference. Because peace is an intensity disguised as closeness. Peace is ease, presence, a conversation that breathes a little, a connection that unfolds naturally. Instead of trying to force the future into the first hour, you know, once you truly recognize the difference between peace and pressure, it becomes really hard to ignore that anymore. Thank you.